So when you think about some of the big challenges that our world is facing, things like climate change or poverty, global health, do you ever get a little overwhelmed? Like we tried so many solutions already, but the problems just keep happening. Maybe they're too complex, they're too big for us to actually solve. Well, I'm here today to talk to you about how appreciating that complexity and understanding something called systems thinking can help us develop solutions that actually lead to a more sustainable world. So when I say things like systems thinking and complexity theory, that can be a little overwhelming too. But it doesn't have to be. Understanding complexity doesn't have to be complex. When I think about complexity, I think back to one of the greatest movies of the 90s, which is Jurassic Park. And there's this character in the movie named Ian Malcolm, and it's played by Jeff Goldblum. He's the guy with the black curly hair. He's wearing all black in the movie. And he's a self-described chaostician. He's somebody who studies chaos, which falls under that complexity theory umbrella. And there's this scene in the movie, and it's early on, it's before the dinosaurs start to wreak havoc. And Ian Malcolm is in one of the Jurassic Park Jeeps, and he's with some of the other scientists. And he's describing what it is that he studies. And he illustrates it like this. He's talking to Ellie, one of the other main characters. And he has her hold out her hand. And he takes a droplet of water from a glass, and he asks her to predict which way that droplet of water is going to fall. And so as he puts that droplet of water down and it starts going down her hand, he explains that there's these tiny variations that she can't even see, that's in her skin cells and those tiny hairs on your hand, and it's pushing and pulling and forcing that water droplet in different directions. Now imagine if that droplet of water was you, or maybe it's an organization you run, or maybe it's this planet that we're on. Imagine if we could understand those tiny little invisible variations and have some sense of where we were going, maybe even control where we were going. Hollywood actually has a lot to teach us about complexity. There's this other movie that I have to tell you about. This one is a psycho thriller. It came out in 2004. And it's called The Butterfly Effect. And The Butterfly Effect stars Ashton Kutcher. In the movie, he has these seizures that somehow send him back in time, but only for a few minutes until he's rocketed back to the future. So throughout the movie, Ashton tries to make these little changes in his childhood with the hope that he's going to come back to a much better future. And throughout the movie, he does this, and each time, something drastic happens. And a lot of times, that change is this horrible unintended consequence. So don't worry, by the end of the movie, Ashton kind of figures out what he can do and realizes that there's one change he can make that creates this future that he thinks is the best for everybody there. Now, imagine if you had that power. Imagine if you could do one small change. If you could be that butterfly effect. If you could flap your metaphorical wings and create this tidal wave of change somewhere else on the planet. Imagine if you could focus that power on things like climate change and global health and eradicating poverty and sustainability and all those massive challenges that we have. Those are the types of questions that really intrigue me. And I started looking to something called systems thinking to help me find some answers. Now, systems thinking, what is systems thinking? To understand systems thinking, I have to tell another story. And this is an old one, and it's about 4 blind men and an elephant. And it goes like this. There's 4 blind men, and they're walking through a jungle. And they stumble upon an elephant. They don't know it's an elephant, they can't see it. So they have to start touching different parts of the elephant to try to figure out what it is. And so one man reaches out and touches the leg, and after a while concludes that it's a pillar, they must be in front of a house. Another man, he reaches out and he touches the tail of the elephant. And he says, no, this is a rope. We must be somewhere where there's a lot of rope. So the story goes on until a man who can see stumbles upon the 4 blind men arguing about what they found. And he's listening to this argument, and he interjects and says, you all have it wrong. None of you have looked at the whole picture, so none of you understand that you have an elephant in front of you. So in a lot of ways, we can be like those blind men. Think about how we problem solve, how we tackle big issues like that. When we find something we don't know what it is, we break it apart in these tiny, small pieces. And independently, we look at each one, and that's where we do our analysis, and we start to write conclusions. It's a really powerful tool. It's why they teach it in school and why that's how we solve our problems. But as you learn in the story, there's this blind spot. Sometimes the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And systems thinking gives us a way to look at that whole. The way systems thinking works is kind of like this. It studies those parts of the system that the blind man would see in the elephant. But it also looks at the interrelations between those parts. looks at things like feedback and how different parts might affect one another over time. Let's illustrate this. We're going to look at a system that we have right here. There's two parts in the system. There's you, the audience, and then there's me, the speaker. Now, all by ourselves, we're not that exciting. The really cool stuff is happening in this interrelation that we have going on right now. I'm talking and it's meaning something to you. And then you're producing this feedback that's coming back into what I'm thinking about and what I'm talking about. So let's imagine that I'm up here talking and it's the really boring part of my talk and I'm starting to lose the audience. The phones are coming out, or text messages. Maybe the people in the back are starting to nod off. It's all those classic signs of a really boring speaker. What's happening there is that a lot of that is feeding back into what I'm doing. And as a speaker, I need to think, what can I do to get my audience engaged again? So maybe I'll pause. Try to remember what I'm talking about, get back on message if I've been rambling. Or maybe I'll do something big and loud and really get up in there to try to wake everybody up. If I'm successful at that, your engagement as an audience is going to go back up too. Now, if we were to look at this system behavior in a chart, it might look like something like this. You have your engagement over there, it's on the y-axis, and then we have this time element, all the time we're taking up this talk right here on the x-axis. And that wiggly line right in the middle, that's audience engagement. Now, it's not perfectly straight. Sometimes it goes up and down, depending on what I'm talking about. But every time it goes a little too low, I'll do something to wake everybody up. And once everybody's awake, I start thinking about other stuff. Maybe I'm making sure I'm on track with time, I'm not losing, forgetting things. I might lose you a little bit, and you'll go down a little bit. But overall, what we have here is a balanced system. We've created sustainable audience engagement, which is really the goal, sustainability. Systems thinkers look at this another way. We have charts like this. This is something called a causal loop diagram. And this is still our system that we were talking about earlier. We still have the audience level of engagement over on that side. And over here we have the speaker activity, the things I'm doing to keep people engaged. And these big arrows that we have, that's showing all the feedback that's happening. That's the dynamic part of the system. And each of those arrows has a little plus or a minus next to it. Now, what those are, that's talking about how that feedback is interacting. If my speaker activity to get everybody engaged goes up, then your level of engagement goes up too. There's a positive correlation there. When your level of engagement is up, I'm not worried about it quite so much. So the level of speaker activity might drop down a little bit. So there's a negative correlation. It's going in opposite directions. It's this mix of positive and negative correlations in the feedback that give us this balanced system. So that's systems thinking in a nutshell. This is a way that systems thinkers can start looking at things, to start understanding things like feedback and interrelations. But how do you apply this to things like poverty or climate change? How can you actually do something with this knowledge? To answer that, I have to share another story with you. And this isn't my story. This is a friend of mine from Malawi. And when we first met, Malawi was going through a hunger crisis. And they were looking for solutions. And so the world mobilized its food aid programs. And they sent food trucks into all the villages around Malawi. And they passed out free food so people wouldn't be hungry anymore. These people were fed, the trucks weren't needed, so they could move on to the next village. Now, a system like that might look like something like this. It's the same balancing loop that we just learned about. You have hunger in Malawi over here, and as that goes up, food aid trucks show up in the villages, start passing out food. As hunger starts dropping down, as the hunger starts dropping down, the food aid trucks aren't going to be needed anymore, so they can move on to the next village. Great, we have a solution. Maybe even a sustainable solution that's going to solve world hunger. The systems thinking tells us that there might be more to the story than just this balancing loop. Just like Ashton Kutcher and the butterfly effect. When he was trying to figure out solutions that would work right, there might be some unintended consequences that we need to look for. In this case, there is. So we still have this balance loop right here, where hunger in Malawi is being solved by these food aid trucks. But those food aid trucks are doing something else. There's farmers in Malawi that are producing a lot of the produce that people eat. And farmers are starting to realize it's a lot easier to go get free food from the food trucks than it is to wake up early and farm their fields. So they start leaving the farms and following the food trucks around. What happens then is that the local farming activity becomes even more difficult. And that puts this huge amount of positive pressure on hunger in Malawi. So if we were to look at this system over time, it might look like something like this. We still have behavior over on that y-axis and time still over here. And we have that unintended consequence. The difficulty for local farmers, it's increasing. It's increasing at an exponential rate, which is really scary to think about. At the same time, you have your hunger in the Malawi. And it's this weird line. And the reason it's doing this is because it's going up as this exponential pressure is increasing. And then the food trucks show up, and so it'll drop down for a little while, and the food trucks leave. And the hunger spikes right back up, and it's increasing this whole time. Systems thinkers see issues like this a lot. In fact, I have a name for it. It's called fixes that fail. The problem is that we spend a lot of time and money and energy and resources trying to solve hunger problems in Malawi. But the solution that we created doesn't actually solve the problem in the long term. And worse, it's created this other unintended consequence that's going to cause problems in the future. So as we start to appreciate complexity, we start to learn about things like systems thinking, we can start thinking about solutions that are actually going to solve our problems for the long term and do it in a sustainable way. So what types of organizations are doing things like that? I want to tell you about a place that I work right now called TEDx. And TEDx is a prize competition. And we challenge entrepreneurs to focus all of their talents on the developing world. For us, the D can stand for development, but it can also stand for distribution. One of the things we look for are solutions to poverty that are already proven and already effective. In a sense, we're kind of looking for that metaphorical butterfly effect. And then we want to help scale it up. So we challenge entrepreneurs to find those solutions and then develop ventures that are going to scale up proven solutions. And the best ones, we offer award funding so that they can start their ventures and get launched and start making an impact. So what does this have to do with complexity? Well, a lot of what we do at TEDx is research poverty issues. And when we're doing our research, we look at things like these unintended consequences. We look for those tiny variations, and we start looking for what else might be happening, and why hasn't a lot of these problems already been solved. Another thing we get to look for are those solutions, those butterfly effect solutions that are able to make a big difference for a lot of people. So let me give you a quick example. One of the issues that we're working on right now is unintended teen pregnancies and HIV infections in the developing world. This has been a problem for a long, long time. And there's solutions out there that have been also around for a long, long time. We can talk about abstinence-only education, or we can talk about safe sex and condom advocacy. But even though they've been around for a while, the problem hasn't yet really been solved. And so at TEDx, we'll dive into a problem like that, and we'll start researching, start asking more questions. Is there something else going on? Is there more complexity here? One of the things that we found out, which I thought was really interesting, was that young women are 3 times more likely to have HIV infections than their male counterparts. Why is that? What's happening there? We're not the only ones that are asking these questions. There's a professor at Stanford who teaches economics who was looking at the same thing. And she hypothesized it wasn't that people weren't hearing about things like safe sex or abstinence-only education. It was that the relationships that they were in weren't allowing them to even make choices. She started looking at the types of relationships that young women were in and realized that a lot of them were partnering with older men, which she called sugar daddy relationships. And in a sugar daddy relationship, there's an asymmetrical power dynamic. Young women weren't able to insist on things like condom use or abstinence-only education, even though they knew about it. So with this appreciation for the complexity of this whole system, a new program was put into place. It's called Sugar Daddy Awareness Classes. In Sugar Daddy Awareness Classes, it's exactly what you would expect. There was a 20-minute animated video about a young girl who was dealing with sugar daddy issues. There was a 20-minute Q&A. And in the middle, there was a 20-minute lecture where an educator would talk about how different demographics of different partners had more or less risky parts associated with them. 1-hour class. The results were absolutely phenomenal. Unwanted teen pregnancies dropped 28% because of this. Whereas with abstinence-only education and condoms, I haven't really seen those same results. And at the same time, teen pregnancies is a great metric to measure things like risky sexual behavior. So at DPRES, when we find a solution like this, we get really, really excited. We see that this is something that can actually solve problems so that they stay solved. And it's not going to create any unintended consequences in the future. We don't see this fixes that fail problem with things like sugar daddy education. So when we find these types of educations, we look for entrepreneurs who are ready to scale up these ventures. What we want to do is fund businesses that are going to reach, or that are going to share the Sugar Daddy Awareness Education class with 10,000 girls this summer. And in 2 years, we want to hit 500,000 girls. That's the type of sustainable change that we really need to see in this world. So, if there's 2 things that I hope you take away from this talk, this is what it is. The first is I hope that you can understand and appreciate complexity, and not be scared by it, and realize that it's something that with some time and effort you can really start to understand. There's tools out there like systems thinking and these causal loop diagrams that I showed you that can help. As systems thinkers, we think a lot about problems rather than solutions. Normally when people start thinking about solving a problem, they'll diagnose it really quickly and then jump right into thinking about what their solution would look like. Systems thinking tells us to flip that around, to spend more time thinking about the problem, to look for those tiny variations that are going to affect our solutions, those unintended consequences that might also affect things. The second thing that I hope you take away is this. There's solutions out there. Whether it's you applying to something like DPRIZE, starting a venture that can scale up, help millions of people, right? Whether it's something radically different but equally important that is going to solve these big, complex sustainability challenges, I hope you go for it. I hope you flap your metaphorical butterfly wings and make some change happen. There's solutions out there. It's just a matter of us understanding our complex systems before we can find them. Thank you.